And the odds were, at that time, in every 80 missions, you'd get shot down. I was shot down at 81. I was hit by the fifth of 5 missiles fired at my aircraft. We were just 24 aircraft flying 20,000 feet into Hanoi in VFR conditions, visual flight rules. And Kelly Patterson says, let's eject. So we held a little conference, and very brief I might add, but we opted to ride the aircraft to give us a chance to meet the mountain range. Then he ejects. I must wait 1 second for, if we jet together, our seats collide. And we had the jets in the canopy, and we're at 500 knots, so it's a big shock from a peaceful aircraft into the elements, floating down, having lost everything, freedom, family, and waiting for the enemy to capture you down on the deck.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade
to meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
I was born in North Carolina, Newbern, North Carolina, where my father was a sharecropper. Came from a very poor family, but he gave me the option. We lived on a farm in the city limits of Kinston, North Carolina, and he gave me the option of plowing or playing. And I played every sport that came down the pike. And through sports, I was able to get a scholarship to college and was able to graduate. I was the first in my family to ever graduate from college. So I graduated, had a coaching job, and the Army was about to draft me, and so the only way I could finish the school year of teaching and coaching would be to get a deferment. So I started looking for ways, and there was a Navy program called a NAVCAD program, Naval Aviation Cadet, and it was available, and I applied for that, and it would extend me for 6 months, allow me to finish the school year, and then I could go in. So I joined that. I'd never flown at that point. I'd never flown an aircraft, but it allowed me to finish the coaching in my teaching year.
And where did you do your flight training?
At Pensacola. I finished flight training in Pensacola, was married in between Pensacola and Corpus Christi to my wife Dorothy, who we've been married 68 years. And then I went to Corpus Christi, where I got my wings after 4 months. I was to an A1 program, A1 aircraft in Oceana, which is a AD Skyraider, and it was a single engine aircraft, had the capability of delivering a nuclear weapon, single engine, and I started out in that and flew that for about 8 years, became an instructor at Oceana, but stayed there, and then went on from Oceana to a tour aboard USS Independence, a ship's company, as a carrier control approach officer, and then left that program and went back to Oceana into the A-6, which was state-of-the-art all-weather aircraft, jet. And that was my first experience with jet aircraft. It was after 8 years.
Was that a pretty selective aircraft assignment? Or?
It was a state-of-the-art aircraft. Came out in 1964, and I deployed in it in 1966 to Vietnam. And we were the third aircraft in the A-6. It was an all-weather bomber, 2-seat aircraft, state-of-the-art. The bombardier-navigator was the heart of the system. He sat back about 4 inches down a little bit. He felt a computer that I flew by. And during the monsoon season in Vietnam, we were the only aircraft that could get in, because we were all weather.
What are the biggest challenges in taking off and landing from a carrier in your experience?
Well, every landing is different. In the daytime, it becomes sort of routine, but at night, different sea state, different moonlighting. All we see as pilots are the runway lights, centerline lights, and the datum lights, which tells us we're high or low. And that's all we see. We don't see the ship. And so we fly for the centerline, and we enjoy a good moon. When you don't have the moon, and sometimes you have rain, so it's a different landing every night. In daytime it's routine, but at night it's always different and very challenging. And to say your heart rate at night on a carrier landing is the highest of any activity that can happen to man.
Both during and after their captivity, the Vietnam prisoners of war proved incredibly resilient because they had each other to lean on. the ultimate support network. None of us should face life's battles alone, and seeking help when we need it is always a sign of strength. That is why we are proud to note that today's story is sponsored by BetterHelp. They make starting therapy less intimidating, offering sessions through calls, video chats, or messaging. Whatever feels right for you. With BetterHelp, you're matched with a licensed therapist from over 30,000 experts, ensuring you find the support you need. Join millions who have found a path to a healthier, happier life with BetterHelp. Click the link below or visit betterhelp.com/AVC to get 10% off your first month. Support yourself, find your network, and start your journey with BetterHelp today.
Our objective, the missions were targets at night primarily, because we were the only aircraft able to get in 24/7. And in fact, we were so good at getting in, the Air Force tried to buy the A-6, but then the war changed and they backed away from it. But we'd go in at night about 300 feet to targets all over Vietnam. And the navigator, of course, was the heart of the system. And the bad part of night, you can see all the tracers that come after you. Every fifth round is a tracer, and you can see the tracers coming in. You try to stay ahead of those. Well, you've got to be very accurate in where you're going. We were 300 feet, 1,000 feet, the SAM level was the SAM level. So anything below 1,000, you were pretty safe. So we tried to stay below 1,000, but down 300 to 400 feet, and would go sometimes inland 50, 60 miles, around 500 knots. And I would just follow steering, and the navigator would give me a banana about every 2 or 3 hours and said, follow steering, and I'd just keep going because you can teach a monkey to fly, you know. And the odds were, at that time, in every 80 missions, you'd get shot down. I was shot down at 81. In fact, on my mission, we were supposed to be in port, but it was a major escalation point, and we were elevated to an Alpha strike, which is controlled out of Washington, out of White House. And that was a special strike, and we were called away from going into port, which was our 2 weeks off, to fly this mission. And we went in to Hanoi for the first time in about 3 years, and the flight was heavy. I was hit by the fifth of 5 missiles fired at my aircraft. We were just 24 aircraft flying 20,000 feet into Hanoi in VFR conditions, visual flight rules. So you're fair game. Well, we were hit by the missile, and we looked out ahead, and there was a mountain range about a mile away, and we could have ejected because we were on fire from the missile. And Kelly Patterson says, let's eject. So we held a little conference, and very brief, I might add, but we opted to ride the aircraft to give us a chance to meet the mountain range. Then he ejects. I must wait 1 second for, if we jet together, our seats collide. And we had to jettison the canopy, and we're at 500 knots, so it's a big shock from a peaceful aircraft into the elements. And floated down, and he landed on one side of the mountain, I landed on the other, but that was it. And of course I was captured and taken into a village, stripped of my clothes, given a little food, and then carried because I couldn't walk. And then they loaded me on a truck, and en route to Hanoi 2 days, in the back of a truck with a 50-gallon barrel of gasoline in the back without a top. And every time they went over a bump, the gasoline would slosh out onto me. But they stopped twice en route to Hanoi at different army facilities to invite the people to come in and have a look at us, and they could have one go at us. They could spit on us, throw a rock at us, slap us, or whatever they want. So when we got to the Hanoi Hilton, it was kind of a relief to be away from those angry crowds into a prison. And we went there, and my navigator was alive on the ground for 4 days and disappeared. And I have reason to believe he was taken to the Soviet Union for technical knowledge. And it's very unfortunate that he was 8 years my junior, could very well be alive today. I'm 92, he would be 84, so. Into the Hanoi Hilton, they put you in a solitary cell, just a concrete slab. Moved in there, and then they started to work pretty quick. What targets, what were you flying? And I maintained I was flying the A-1, which I started out in many years ago. And obviously they knew I was in a different aircraft, but I hung to that story. And it was just very brutal, and you get through it about 2 weeks later, and your hands are useless, and they just throw you into another cell. And I was in solitary confinement for about a month, and then I moved in with a young man shot down the same raid that I was, Bill Metzger. And they moved me in with him because his wounds were life-threatening. Mine were not. Moved me in to take care of him. And I picked him up off the floor. He had a wound on his left leg about that long, about that deep, where a 4-pound piece of shrapnel was embedded. His right arm was ripped open from the wrist to the elbow, and his right leg was broken and healed overlap 3 inches. So it was 6'3" on his left leg and 5'8", 9 on his right leg. And we lived together for about 2 years and nursed him back to health. And he too came home with me in 1973 on the same flight. Well, for me, mine was a little different because in 1969 we had the second of 2 escape attempts by the same prisoner, Ed Atterbury and John Dermisi. And I had moved out of the Hanoi Hilton into a facility called the Zoo Annex. There was the zoo, a camp that had about 200 prisoners, and the Zoo Annex, which had about 40 prisoners, and they moved me into the Zoo Annex. And from the annex, you can see the zoo. And I lived there for about 6 months, and then they moved me from the Zoo Annex into the zoo. And my cell in the zoo had the only opening to the Zoo Annex. And through that opening, we established communications throughout the camp, and we could get a question and answer through 69 walls and back to 220 prisoners within 24 hours. We were very sophisticated. But the spot that we had to communicate from was 10 feet off a concrete slab. So my cellmate would get on my shoulders and communicate, and then I'd get on his shoulders and communicate through that hole. So we were able to talk to 220 prisoners, and it all came through my window. And then we had an escape attempt on May 10th, 1969. And they opted not to tell us about the escape attempt because the senior officer lived in my camp, and he would say no escape because it was impossible to escape without outside help. Because I was 6'3", the average Vietnamese is about 5'8", and right downtown Hanoi, so you've got to get 110 miles to the coast, almost impossible. But the guy wanted to escape for one reason, to put himself in for the Medal of Honor when he got out, John Dermisi. And he escaped and was caught the first night, and then he brought back to camp, and one of the 2 escapees, Ed Atterbury, an Air Force major, was tortured to death over the next couple of weeks. And some 20 people were tortured very brutally over the next 6 weeks. And the escape was May 10th. On June 16th, 1969, they came to my cell to get me to go up to confirm all that the 20 men prior to me had said on the heavy torture, which is impossible because they knew we communicated through my window, but we knew nothing about the escape. But after the escape, they communicated through there. We had an escape last night, so we knew that. So what they wanted from me, I didn't know. And I was brutalized for 2 weeks, beaten with a fan belt daily, one time over 100 times with a spread eagle on the floor, no clothes, fan belt on this side and this side, 2 guards, alternating licks. And went through that 7 days, 7 nights without sleep, kneeling on pitted concrete. It was just brutal, and I dropped about 65 pounds during that 2-week period. And you say, well, how do you know how much you lost? Well, they had a cistern where we bathed in, and we learned how to measure water, and you could get in the cistern, and how much water it took to displace you, you weighed. So I weighed about 115 pounds, having lost about 60 pounds in those 2 weeks. And that was brutal because what they wanted, I didn't have. And finally I said, I'm the escape committee. And they said, well, what are you going to take with you? I said, we have some supplies hidden in the bath area. And they stopped the torture, went out and dug the bath area up, looking for the things that I said I had that we didn't have. So it was a very brutal time. But then in 1970, we had the Sante raid, which they came into Sante with 6 helicopters, and the plan was to crash a helicopter in the compound to remove 72 prisoners that lived in that compound. And they executed the raid in 1970, I believe November the 20th, my date might be a little off, landed in the compound, and there was to crash one in the middle of the compound and land the other 5 outside to remove the 72 men to freedom. And the raid was executed perfectly, but when they got there were no prisoners. The prisoners had been moved 2 weeks prior to the raid, and we have since learned that the government knew the camp was vacant anyway. It was strictly a political move to show the American people we're trying something. Then after that, they moved us all back downtown Hanoi into a large cell. I moved into a cell probably 40 by 30 feet where 57 men moved in together for the first time with a large group. And I had 6 feet by 2.5 feet per man for the next 3 years. But we gained strength by moving together. If I didn't like the conversation here, I'd go talk to this guy. So that was a real boost for us to move together like that, and we could resist as a group. And one of the first things that we did as a group was to press the North Vietnamese to have a right to have a church service. And since I had survived some brutal torture, my story had gone through the system, the senior officer asked if I would serve as chaplain. And even though I was not the most devout, I had survived some pretty heavy torture. So I served as chaplain, and each Sunday we would have a 10-minute worship service. We had a 4-man choir, and I would run around the cell during the week trying to get a little scripture here and a little scripture there, and on Sunday we would, and most of the cell of 57 men would participate. A few did not. They professed to be agnostics, but before they came home, they all decided that they had believed in God. So that's how we're able to survive. I rode home for the first time in 3 years, and it's public knowledge now that we were communicating in those letters home. And 10% of all aviators were trained in covert communications. Sure enough, right across the board, we had 10% of us that had the training who taught the other 90% of us how to do it. And we communicated, and all aviators know Morse code. TAP, it's a tap, a dash, and a tap. Well, you can hear the tap, but you can't hear the dash. So that didn't work. We had to develop a new code. And the code was, we took the alphabet, A through E, next 5 letters, and we tapped in 2 groups. The first group of taps would be the column that we were in. The second group of taps would be the line we were in. If I tapped 1-1, the letter A. If I tapped 3-2, third line over, letter 2 letter down, the letter M. 5-5, all the way up to the letter Z. And we had to get 26 letters. You can't square 26 letters, so we had to drop one. So we dropped the letter K. So whenever we had K, we would suffix C for K. So we got very proficient at communications. And at night, you could put your ear on the wall, and it sounds like 60 secretaries typing away, men communicating. I talked to one guy for 3 years, never saw his face. For 3 years, I knew everything about that man, so.
You know, you were listed as missing in action until 1970.
Yes.
How did your family deal with that uncertainty for that amount of time?
It was hard. My wife is the real hero in all of this. She hung in there for 3.5 years not knowing whether I was dead or not. She knew I was on the ground alive, but didn't know whether I made it I was captured and taken to prison. So for 3.5 years, and my children were 8, 6, and 4. And when I came home, they were 15, 13, 11, and they were her children when I came home. I better not criticize them. And I didn't, but she did a great job, and we have a very tight-knit family. We have no divorces, just a wonderful family, so. And I give my wife all the credit for that.
How did you find out that you were going to be free?
Well, the B-52s in 1972 bombed Hanoi for the first time. And one of the most exciting things I have ever seen was a B-52 being hit by a surface-to-air missile and floating down into about 8 fireballs. And you say, well, how do you know it was a B-52? Well, the next day, the people who were in that aircraft were in our prison cells. They were captured, except those that were killed. But it was the most spectacular thing I've ever seen. But we said to ourselves, all we did was forward ourselves behind they had given us bed boards, and we would get behind the bed boards on the wall sitting up, very little food for 12 days. But we said when the bombing quits, the war's going to be over, when the B-52s quit coming. And sure enough, after 12 days, they stopped, and 2 days later, they called us out into a compound all together and said, you'll be released in 4 groups. The Paris Peace Accords have been signed, and you'll be released in 4 groups over a 6-week period.
When did that tipping point happen for you where it really sunk in?
I think once on the flight out of Hanoi, I think we realized when it's all over, we have a term in the Navy, feet wet, feet dry. When we fly into the beach, when we hit the beach, feet dry. When we come leave the beach over water, feet wet. And when we flew out of Vietnam on the C-141s, when we went from land to sea, there was a G-jump in the aircraft because we all were so excited about being out of Vietnam in free territory. It was wonderful, a wonderful feeling to be able to come back home to a grateful nation, because, you know, the 3 million men and women who served in Vietnam, who fought the war, had to come home and apologize for serving in a losing war. Very unpopular war. We, the POWs, came home to a great homecoming. I mean, we had thousands of people. I went to my home for the first time after about 6 weeks, and there must have been 6,000 or 8,000 people in my welcoming me home. And you can imagine going into Clark, and all POWs had that experience. But we received the adulation that the 3 million men and women did not. So that's the sad part.